Um, uh, I would also remind everybody to put yourself on mute so we don't have any extraneous noises. But I'm really pleased and privileged to introduce Dr. Peggy Dilworth-Anderson, who's a national leader in the field of Alzheimer's disease research. And I can only highlight a few of her contributions and awards. She's professor of health policy and management at the Gilling School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She focuses on health disparities and culturally relevant Alzheimer's disease research and disseminating information about Alzheimer's disease and related disorders in medically underserved diverse populations. She received the Piermain Prize for Excellence in Research on Aging from the University of Southern California Roybal Institute for her outstanding contributions to the field of translational aging research and its impact on issues directly relating to older people, especially around long-term care and Alzheimer's disease. And among her other awards are a Diversity Award from UNC in recognition of her commitment to diversity and inclusion in research, teaching, and leadership, and the Ronald and Nancy Reagan Alzheimer's Research Award for research contributions in Alzheimer's disease in medically underserved populations from the Alzheimer's Association. She served on many leadership roles and national boards, including president of the Gerontological Society of America, member of the Global Council on Brain Health, committees of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and the National Research Advisory Council of the National Institute on Aging. She's mentored many graduate students, junior and mid-career faculty, and in recognition of her mentoring, she received the Minority Task Force Mentor Award from the GSA and the UNC Faculty to Faculty Mentoring Award from the Carolina Women's Leadership Council. She's a graduate of Tuskegee Institute. She earned her master's and doctoral degrees in sociology from Northwestern and did postdoctoral training from the Midwest Council of Social Research in Aging. She's a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America and the National Council on Family Relations. And today, the title of her professional development seminar is Practicing Good Science, the Inclusion of Diverse Populations in Alzheimer's Research. And I would urge you to put questions in the chat, and we'll have 15 minutes or so discussion at the end of the presentation. And then following this session, Dr. Dilworth-Anderson has kindly agreed to meet with the RCMAR scientists in a separate session with a separate Zoom link. So Dr. Dilworth-Anderson, I thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Gallo, for that introduction. There's only one thing a couple of things I'd like to add to that. One is I received the Lifetime Achievement Award at the AAIC this past summer at the International Alzheimer's meeting, and for my body of work, which means that you only get it if you're older. And so you have to create a body of work, so that reflects longevity. And the other thing, the great achievement is I'm a full-time grandmother, and that's keeping me in the geriatric community and looking at things through the eyes of kids as well as older people and seeing all the different connections in terms of developmental changes. So thank you for that introduction. Ms. Washington will be advancing my slides for me today. And I want to thank Johns Hopkins University for inviting me to give this presentation today. I look forward to the exchange when I'm done. So as noted on the slide, the presentation today is on practicing good science, the inclusion of diverse populations in Alzheimer's research. I decided to title this presentation this way because I myself struggle with what is good science around Alzheimer's research. Where can I find good science? And where are we now in terms of our scientific practices, and where can we go in the future? This presentation is present oriented, but it is also strongly future oriented in terms of where we need to go. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with the goals of the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, in terms of our values and our scientific validity and fair subject selection, risk-benefit ratio, our informed consent practices, and the respect for potential and enrolled subjects. The area that I have highlighted in red is very apropos to our discussion today. Who does the study need to include? To answer this question, it is asking. The primary basis for recruiting and enrolling groups and individuals should be the scientific goals of the study, not vulnerability, privilege, or other factors unrelated to the purposes of the study. Consistent with the scientific purpose, people should be chosen in a way to minimize risk and enhances benefits to individuals and society. The first part of this statement, which is part of the practices, and I shouldn't say practices, the policies of the NIH, is who does the study need to include? And of course, we'll be talking about that quite a bit. Next slide, please. Why inclusive clinical research on Alzheimer's represents good science? Why is practicing good science and even an issue for me and for other people? This is a quote that I took from an article that I co-authored with some colleagues just recently, which was in JAMA Neurology, is that racial and ethnic groups with higher rates of clinical Alzheimer's disease are underrepresented in studies of AD biomarkers, including amyloid. And we know that African Americans and Hispanics oftentimes have Alzheimer's disease or diagnosed, but the amyloid levels are much lower as compared to whites. We don't know a lot about why these differences exist. We know these differences exist. And it's very difficult, according to some people, to recruit African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, as well as the indigenous people in our clinical research. So for many of us, we ask ourselves, is a paradigm shift needed? What would a paradigm shift entail? Who generates the shift? What institutions adopt and advance the paradigm shift? What are the consequences? These are questions that I will attempt to answer as I go through this presentation. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think can lead us to answering some of these questions, if not all, is that we can question whether good science is being practiced and what is good science going to do for us and what does it look like. Science is critical for progress in the 21st century, but it is essential that what is learned from science is understood and respected by the public. Recognizing that there is no size-fits-all solution, the remarkable cultural diversity in the US will require context and culture-specific messaging and engagement. This is very critical because, as we know, the clinical trials and most of the clinical research on Alzheimer's disease is not diverse. It doesn't take advantage of many of the remarkable differences as well as similarities in our population that could certainly lead to understanding the disease much better. Next slide, please. So what are some characteristics of good science and clinical trials, given that we desperately need them? Clinical trials are the driving force behind breakthroughs that prevent outbreaks and allow us to treat diseases. Without these trials, and this is something that most, if not all, the people on this in this meeting know, but I thought it would be helpful to remind us, what is good science going to give to us? What can we do with this good science in regards to clinical trials? And what will the public, how can the public benefit from it? So we know by including racial and ethnic diversity in trials, maybe it can lead to scientific opportunities to more fully understand the factors that lead to disease or health. So lack of diversity really leads to lack of knowledge. That's what that statement is saying. When we have diversity, we have a stronger critical eye. We understand the complexities given the variations of people and the comorbidities that they bring to the clinical encounter. Clinical trials can ensure that those affected by the diseases will accrue the benefits of the research. Right now in the country, we have supposedly medications that are available to treat Alzheimer's, and the trials, one trial had 0.6% of African Americans. Although African Americans are indicated as having twice as likely to have Alzheimer's as whites. That is an approach that's counter to the scientific process. Those who are most affected are the least understood. That's counter to science, and particularly good science. Researchers have an ethical and professional responsibility in conducting good science. And practicing good science is true to social justice. So this constant, persistent exclusion doesn't speak to social justice. Therefore, we will most likely find a cure. We will most likely continue to disenfranchise the most disenfranchised suffering from Alzheimer's disease. So good science is at the heart of what we want to do. Some people are very uncomfortable talking about race and ethnicity in regards to what we're doing in relation to clinical research in Alzheimer's. But let's talk about just being good scientists. Then that would subsume representation. That would subsume understanding the multiple contexts in which people become ill. If you're uncomfortable with race, ethnicity, diversity, I hope everyone, as scientific as we claim we are, let's practice good science. And then we wouldn't have to worry about all these things that make us uncomfortable around issues of race and ethnicity and disenfranchisement, if that makes us more comfortable as scientists. Next slide, please. So given where we are, several of us, if not a lot of us, believe we need a paradigm shift. We need to shift the way we're thinking so that a breakthrough is inclusive. The scientific process that leads to the breakthrough is inclusive. So this paradigm shift, as we know, is a fundamental change in scientific assumptions and the practice of science. I would venture to say, and I would think all of us agree on this in this meeting, that we know the fundamentals of the scientific process and the assumptions, but are we practicing it? Are we limited in our scientific practices, not just limited in the scientific methodologies, but we don't employ the methodologies that we've been taught. We know from fundamental methods classes, a representative sample is something that we all learn in Methods 101. The persons suffering with the disease or suffering with anything, we need a representation of the problem. When we lack that representation, we are not using the scientific assumptions in the practice of science. So this shift challenges us to get back to the basics of the scientific process. Use the scientific assumptions. And again, if we're uncomfortable with race, ethnicity, discrimination, Black Lives Matter, everybody matters, let's just be good scientists and practice good science. So changing the way scientists think about and conceptualize how to study and who to study will require of us developing new skills and expertise. We'll have to ask new questions. new or refined measures or samples are needed, and new knowledge will be generated. So this is really about the scientific process. If we're not asking the right questions to get diverse samples, let's find out how to ask the questions and develop recruitment strategies that will make our samples more inclusive. If we follow the strict scientific assumptions and add to that in terms of our learning curve, we will find that we can refine our measures. We can re-strategize on our recruitment strategies and approaches when the scientific process is used. So this change is needed, not only for the scientists to understand the process, but the change then changes the society that we operate in and that we influence. Next slide, please. What is needed in the shift? Changes in the way scientists think about and conceptualize how to study and who to study. New skills and expertise are needed in recruitment of research participants. New questions are needed to be asked, and new and refined measures again are needed. And of course, will generate new knowledge. I wanted to re-emphasize that again, because these are parts of our scientific processes. We conceptualize differently. We strategize differently. We develop new recruitment strategies differently. Just to give a small example of this process, which I'm holding myself accountable to, as well as my colleagues I'm working with in the New Ideas Study. And my colleague and I at Vanderbilt University, Dr. Consuelo Wilkins, we're in charge of, or primarily in charge, I should say, of the recruitment strategies and methodologies that we're developing. And what we're finding, because we are recruiting Hispanics and African Americans as well as whites in the study, that one size doesn't fit all. And now we know this fundamentally, but when we say one size doesn't fit all, then what does that mean in adjusting and strategizing methods and approaches given different populations that we're recruiting in the clinical research? And we're learning. It's an iterative approach. We improvise, we change, we meet with people, we meet with the people that we're trying to study, and we're looking at our measures in ways that provide a critical eye so that we're not wedded to one methodology. We change because it is very iterative. It's a community engagement approach where the community informs us. We're informing the community, and we're developing interesting methods, new approaches, using some old methods, but adding a new twist to them, given the populations and where they're located in America. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're questioning in this new approach are methodologies and shifting the paradigm is ways of incorporating social justice ideology, concepts, and approaches key to successful clinical research. So two things I'd like to note here that are very important when we're framing our questions in the shift in the paradigm. We need to really get a comprehensive understanding of a people's history, the social determinants of health, political power, and representation. The terminology of social determinants of health is thrown around quite a bit right now in the sciences. But are we really capturing the true impact of those determinants of health, like location, access to broadband, telemedicine, understanding technology, level of education, how far people are from accessible clinics? And so we also know that we need to provide evidence to support addressing healthcare needs and health policies of people in a society. There are many health policies that are getting in the way of us being able to even ask certain questions, and let alone researching these questions. But these are two areas that I feel, and many others feel, that we when we're reframing and moving toward a new paradigm, we need to keep these things before us. We can't develop a one-size-fits-all. We know that a history of a person has a lot to do with things, social determinants of health. And I may add again that in the social determinants of health, let us not forget the impact of life course in understanding these determinants of health. Life course matter in terms of socioeconomic status during the life course, particularly in childhood, access to medical care in the early formative years of a person's development, and the kind of education, not necessarily always the endpoint. You have a 12th grade education, but quality of education. Some of the work that Jennifer Manley has done really informs us on, it's not always about the number of years. The quality of education in those years will have an impact on assessment and access to care and maybe vulnerability to certain diseases. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And again, I'm going to move on from this one. Let's move on to the next slide because I want to make sure that I have enough time for questions and answers. So this slide gives a good quote, I think, that represents so much of what I've been thinking and others are thinking. While sparse studies investigating research participation disparities have predominantly focused on individual level factors and behavioral change, overlooking the influence of study design, structural factors, and social determinants of health on participation. So when we're practicing this good science, we have to move beyond, as these researchers noted, and the references are below, that we need to move beyond investigating the research participation at the individual level. There are structural factors that we must take into consideration to increase diversity in our clinical research and specifically clinical trials. Next slide, please. So these are some of the issues that many of us struggle with in these structural issues. Some of the barriers that are structural, some are institutional specific, and some are research specific. But I really want to talk about some of the structural barriers. On the left-hand side of this table, you can see the common barriers for the scientists and the participant level barriers and the study level barriers. But the study structural barriers are really critical in addition to the others being critical. The lack of awareness of the study, fewer minorities refer to specialists, when many of us recruit from specialist clinics in order to get our samples. Need more information on brain imaging. Communities need more of that. Practice sites need support for communities to be able to access them and the practice sites to adhere to our recruitment efforts. So that means that the budgets that we propose to our funders really need to think about all of these structural and study barriers that can influence the access to the sample. Need study materials for families involved in the decision-making. Copay is a big concern for many families, particularly minority families, and transportation limitations, as well as scheduling brain imaging. These are structural barriers that in the New Ideas study that I'm a part of now, we are honing in on these daily, almost daily, improvising, changing, adjusting when we can and need be. This transportation limitation is a big problem for many of us doing this kind of work, particularly getting to brain imaging centers and having access to them. And the scheduling and the wherewithal to go through all of that. And who's going to pay for the copays and the aspects of the recruitment efforts that oftentimes do not cover that. So again, this is a table that gives us some outlines of what are some of the things we struggle with, some of the barriers that we face, and particularly the structural ones that we need to focus on as much as we focus on what we don't know as scientists, what we think participants bring or don't bring, and our study level barriers. So I want to emphasize the structural things that we face as well. Next slide, please. So we know that there are fundamental influences that have influenced us to address these structural barriers and hopefully encourage us to do the right thing in terms of inclusion. I won't go through all of what is here. This is more of a reminder of this is what we should be following. In other words, we should be following the law. The statute requires NIH to ensure that clinical trials are carried out in a manner sufficient to provide a valid analysis of whether the variables being studied affect women and members of minority groups differently than other trial participants. And we know that this has not been adhered to. There's limited, in my opinion, and opinion of others, very limited accountability in this regard. So when we have limited accountability in the face of laws and regulations, it means that the public suffers. Just as the barriers I presented a few minutes ago, we're facing those barriers. But we also know that people in communities are facing barriers too when we don't adhere to acts, laws, and regulations that supposedly require us to include them. So that means that as we go through this paradigm shift, if you buy into it, that we then will more likely ensure that the trials are open to all the people who need to be in the trials, that the trials represent the people most affected by the diseases. So we can have laws, acts, and regulations, but they have to be enforced. We're not enforcing ourselves. And I may say that the institutions in charge of enforcing them are not enforcing them either in regards to the scientific process and the level of exclusion that it has occurred around Alzheimer's disease research. Next slide, please. So these are some statements and questions that I put together for us, and I did it for myself first. If I had to change some of this, hopefully all of what is not happening, so that people who suffer with Alzheimer's and related dementias are involved in the research, how would I conceptualize what's happening? Where would I start? You know, there are a lot of words in a presentation like this, but for me, a visual is always so helpful. I hope it's helpful to the audience. The first thing that I would tackle would include the larger structural institutions, the norms, the practices, and the processes that help create and support the problem and the outcomes. You know, what's happening in these structural, larger structures that put more people in certain populations at risk for diseases? Those are those social determinants of health, possibly. And what are the norms and practices that are feeding into the perpetuation of them? Now, as a researcher and as researchers, we can't tackle all of those things, but to be aware of them at that larger structure. And I inverted this pyramid because in the end, the tip gets us down to addressing the problem. And what professional learned practices and ways of thinking affect defining and maintaining the problem? Are we asking the right questions? Are we approaching the recruitment strategies in a way that people feel that they are welcome and that relate to them? Are we defining the problem in a way that resonates with the people suffering with the problem? Who defines the problem? And what are the outcomes used for? Where are they disseminated? How do the people in the communities know what we found? Well, they don't read JAMA Neurology. They don't go to international conferences. They don't read papers in the Gerontological Society journals. So where are we disseminating this information? Who's in charge of that? Are we as scientists, or are there structural institutions out here that can disseminate this knowledge that we acquire and we know to address the problems that lead hopefully to better practices and hopefully a better life for people and families addressing Alzheimer's disease? Next slide, please. Now, this is another representation of what I just talked about. These foundational influences, the structural factors. And of course, this is slightly different because what I'm presenting here, I'm looking at our training, our experience, and our research teams. I'm looking at the culture, the race, ethnicity, the social determinants of health, the research experience of the community. And I'm looking at the participants and the researchers all together. What can we learn from each other? If you notice, the arrows are going both ways and they're going up and down. They're influences, influencing influences. And so how much are we involved in listening to communities as our participants? And how much are communities listening to us? What do we have to do to get ready? What are the laws and rules and regulations that possibly get in the way of our readiness or do not hold us accountable for being ready? This is what this diagram is about. For me as a researcher, it always helps for me to diagram out what I should be doing, what I could be doing, and what I am doing. So I try to live by these diagrams that I presented today. Next slide, please. So in this paradigm shift, again, we want to look at our assumptions. We want changes in the way that scientists think about and conceptualize the problem with new skills and expertise. We want new questions to be asked. We want new and refined measures. And we want to reject old information and findings that no longer fit the new knowledge that is being generated. We will get new knowledge when we get new people in our trials. We will get complementary knowledge when we get other people who complement those in our current trials. This will lead to better care and hopefully a cure when we expand, moving toward a paradigm shift. I'm convinced we need a shift, not a new method. We need a complete paradigmatic shift in our thinking, not throwing away our measures, but looking at the relevance of them, looking at, can they be adapted? Can they be extended? But for me as a scientist involved in this for many decades now, it is more about the way the scientist is thinking about the problem. And that is the absence of certain things, not the presence of certain things. It is the absence of the people where the thinking is void of them. Therefore, our measures are not expansive enough, not inclusive enough. Can we refine them? Can we ask different questions when we move toward inclusion? I'm convinced we can. We'll know more. We will address more around this disease. Next slide, please. So a new paradigm moves to social justice, of course. It will lead us to a larger systemic context. We can use a bi-directional approach. We can engage the communities that emphasize reciprocity, investment, empowerment. And these relationships can be bi-directional. That is exactly what we're doing in the new ideas now. I must say, I haven't been this excited about research as I am now for a long time. You know how we do the same things over and over, and we know how to do it. We become comfortable with it. But I'm excited about the bi-directional relationships that we have created in our community engagement model that we're using, and the manner in which we are recruiting, and the methodologies old methodologies we're refining and developing new approaches based on what the communities need and how we can engage them. And we know that cost and time are associated with engagement. When we write our proposals, let's think about community engagement work It's expensive, it's time consuming, and it's labor intensive. So we have to look at our research teams. Do we have teams that understand how to practice this? Do we have the manpower? Do we have the budget to go out and do this work, which is quite iterative? And when I mean iterative, we can develop an approach. We know that it has to be revised within that approach. Something has to be revised in that approach, which means we may have to slow down something in order to move ahead. That's a different way that we often engage in research. It's not a paradigm shift, but it is at least encouraging us to know that we can shift in the paradigm that we're using. And we know that this is very important to move toward an inclusive science. Next slide, please. And of course, this inclusive approach requires of us, again, to be ready. So how do we get ready for what I'm suggesting and proposing? So we know that readiness is a state of being fully prepared to perform the task, the job, the willingness to do something. Now, for me as a scientist, and I'm not suggesting everyone should do this, I just start reading everything I can to get ready. If I'm moving in a community that I know very little about or that I should have in my research, I'm going to start doing my homework, not only in the literature, but I'm going to start talking to people in those communities, potential type subjects, scientists who understand that community, unlike I don't, and expanding my references in terms of who can I go to for a consult, understanding what is it going to take to be prepared and to be ready. So readiness, we know, is both objective and subjective in meaning. See, the objective part is having the skills, knowledge, and understanding. The subjective part is telling ourselves, recognizing among ourselves, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I got funding. I said I was going to recruit these people, but it's so difficult. So that's really saying, I really don't know exactly how to do this, except for a certain point. So that means really having self-reflection, looking at our intellectual acuity. How emotionally attached are we to what we proposed? Is it an affront to scientific self to say, I really don't quite know how to get these people in this study? And going to a team, that's pretty much where we are. That means that we have to really think about the social emotional part of what I propose to do and what I'm able to do. So that requires us to move toward that shift. I've really got to pause now and get the right people at the right time to help me move the study along. So readiness in aging research cannot occur without a paradigm shift that incorporates the scientists, the participants, and funding organizations. So it's not just us as scientists. When we pause and we go back and we say we need more money to do this, that means going back to a funding agency. You know, we've been funded, but it's going to cost much more money because I didn't propose enough in getting my sample. So to move toward this shift, there needs to be some flexibility in our readiness and what readiness and being prepared really looks like. Next slide, please. So addressing the problem, I won't go through all of this, but basically we're going to expand beyond specialty care centers, using different strategies in our recruitment. We want to reduce participants' lack of access, fear of exploitation, fear of stigmatization and discrimination, financial constraints, and competing demands. Readiness allows us to do this. If we know all of these things and more beyond what we know, we are more than ready, I believe, to get our participants in our research so that we can reduce the barriers that researchers face when they're trying to recruit diverse populations and develop an inclusive approach to research on Alzheimer's disease. Next slide, please. And again, these are ways of thinking about organizations that we need to involve ourselves with and keeping track of our community partners when we develop them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end with some conclusions here. A lot has been said, a lot has been proposed. And these are some checks that I try to live by. The researchers committed to a diverse and inclusive approach use personal reflection and examinations of one's scientific research concerning race, culture, ethnicity, and context. Willing to reject engaging and employing old ways of practicing science. You know, what I learned at Northwestern University, having graduated in the 70s, there's very little that I can use today. But what I do use from that education in terms of my methods classes is understanding the fundamental reasons why we need good methods. Now, what a good methodology is today, clearly it's not a good methodology for me anyway, maybe for someone else, and what I understood in 1975. But I learned that good science requires good methodologies. Inclusive conceptual models need to guide recruitment and retention. These are scientific processes that require a model for recruitment, not actions, but models that lead to actions. We need to embed culture, race, ethnicity in the context of these research models. Use culturally sensitive, appropriate measures. And of course, put in time and cost. Report results to reflect diversity and inclusivity. And it prepares the field for the future, which means a more diverse America. We're already diverse, but we don't have diverse science. We have diverse people with diseases, but we don't understand disease in a diverse context. That's counter to science. We need to apply and adhere to the established American laws and regulations that direct science. And I must say personally, as an African-American and as a scientist, I am very disappointed that so much dysregulation is occurring around the structural laws and regulations that are not adhered to without accountability. We need to work to bring organizational and institutional change to create diversity and inclusion in clinical research. So where we are, where we work, what we are about, look around as I try to do and say, what can I change in this organization to make it more inclusive, make it more diverse, to lead to understanding Alzheimer's disease more. So these are checks that I try to live by. I encourage you to look at them and think, maybe they make sense. Maybe I can incorporate some, if not all, and some of the approaches that I'm using and approaches I can use in the future. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to stop now and entertain any comments and questions you have.
Very good, thank you. Well, while you were talking, there's been a couple of things going on in the chat, and we probably could start with that. And I don't know if I should just be better to just let people talk, but there was well, one thing that came up that hope you don't mind me using your first name, Betsy.
Oh, sure.
Mentioned about the new ideal study, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the goals of that study are.
Well, right now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but we're really looking at amyloid, and we're looking at some other markers to understand. As we well know, given where we are on plaque present, plaque absent, is it the amyloid or not? And given what is happening in America around the medications that are supposedly breakthrough medications, clearing out amyloid when it's less likely to be present in African Americans, what does that say about the breakthrough medications?
Gotcha. Yeah.
So this is a study that involves a large team of people, and I'm not at liberty to talk about everything regarding the
Yeah.
study.
Okay. No,
But
that's
it does address populations that have been marginalized in terms of understanding this disease,
Yeah.
Hispanics and African Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Thank you for
Mhm.
clarifying. The other was Gail. I wonder if you want to just come on and talk, because I think those are really interesting points you were making. Some of them about the idea of that we talk about these groups, persons of color, as if they're monolithic
Mhm.
groups.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Dr. Joe, for just moderating this. I'm really enjoying the presentation. And Dr. Dilworth, I've been wanting to hear you speak for a long time. Dr. Patricia Hill Collins is one of my mentors. I took courses from her after I left the University of California, Davis. And I'm really passionate about the field of cognitive aging, especially as it concerns older African American women. I've been doing some light observations in the rural South, in Birmingham, Alabama. But my question specifically relates to your brilliant presentation. So many great points, but the research and methods point really resonates with me because, in the, my aunt also is a librarian. And so she worked in Montgomery, Alabama in the 50s. And she shared with me that there was a time when we said Black, people just said it meant Black men. So Black women didn't really have any agency. And now when we do research, we look at intersectionality, we look at Black women. And so we have better ways to capture certain disparities across race and class. And I think, for me, that gives me hope, because if we don't have the methodologies to capture these things, we put everyone in the same, we lump everyone together and we miss the disparities that people assume. And then the other related question is, as a woman of color in academia, and I've had these instances happen, I'm sure most women of color or people of color may have encountered it. If you're talking about something that's race related and you're a person of color, sometimes I've had people think, oh, what's going on with you, Gail? Are you okay? Are you being defensive? And I'm talking about something that relates to, let's say, women of color. And specifically from my white colleagues, they mistake that to be sometimes an accusation. When I happen to be Black, I do research in, minority health disparities and trying to demystify, all of these sort of impositions. And then also women of color are placed in the academy. It's perfectly fine. And I think it's important that all races and cultures do research looking at minority groups, but the experiential knowledge and the lived experience of those people, I think sometimes that doesn't get appreciated. And I don't know if it's because my white colleagues have not lived in those communities. And it would be no different if I was doing research on white rural women. Would I talk to white women? Would I have colleagues that were white? And finally, I want to close on this. I have training in psychiatric epidemiology, and I don't know, most of you probably know this, but the DSM-3 categorized homosexuals as not normal. It was considered a disorder. And then they went back and updated it. And I'm just throwing that out as a sidebar because we are constantly learning more about human populations and health. And so we need to update not only the science, but also our growth as scientists, because if I'm doing research with other scientists and they may have the methodological rigor, but in their minds, they're still seeing me in the way that maybe people perceived, Black women or Black people in the 1940s or 50s or 60s, it undermines the work that I'm trying to do. So we need the university to also shift and change with the times, and also hire more qualified researchers of color. I mean, if we're getting NIH money and we're studying people of color, I would not feel good if I was studying that group and did not bring the very people that have been historically underrepresented, if I were to leave them out. So we have to, capture underrepresented populations and include them, not just by giving them a space, but allowing them to feel welcome in the academy and to have a voice. So
thank you for that, Gail. Well, actually, you described a part of shifting the paradigm. It's larger than a person. It's larger than a question. It's larger than a methodology. It's shifting the paradigm. And this is why I wanted to talk about this. I'm biased toward younger scientists, I must say, that not to do what is being done. We will not get, in my opinion and that of others, any further with this disease if we continue to use the approaches we're using. It is anti-scientific to not study people most vulnerable to a disease to understand the disease. Everybody, I think, on this call, in this Zoom, took lots of methods. And we know in Methods 101, a representative sample is the sample that represents the problem. So it is fundamentally against the scientific process. That's why I say if people are uncomfortable with race, ethnicity, gender differences, just talk science. Let's just talk science. And let's get on a playing field around comfort around, I'm a good scientist. So let's start there. Forget color, race, ethnicity, gender identity. Let's be good scientists in this room. Now, what do we need to do? Let's start there. Let's start the conversation in that place. Well, we got to try something. My idea is try something different. What we're doing now is not yielding. You can't have 0.6% of 1% of a so-called breakthrough drug of people most vulnerable to a disease. That's anti-scientific. That's anti-science. Forget discrimination against people. As scientists, we know that's non-scientific. So my quest is, let's talk paradigm shifting, use our knowledge, what we have, move it from where we can. We're capable. We're very smart in this country, and we got enough money. We got enough to do better. Let's do better. And I'm not a Pollyanna person. So people that really know me, I'm not Pollyanna about anything. But I tell you, we got to rethink this mindset that we're in, that it's leading to a bridge to nowhere. And people in communities they're looking for us for a cure. They're looking to us for a better life. They're looking for us to help them get beyond where they are. Yeah. They don't know what we're doing scientifically. It's anti them. They don't know that.
I think we have.
So I'll stop there. I want to get some other questions.
Yeah, I think Zachary has his hand up.
Thank you for your presentation. I seen you speak a couple times, and I pick up something new every time. I'm one of the early career folks that you mentioned that bias towards, and in thinking about what I want my career to have looked like in 40 years. You make a pretty friendly argument that like it should not look like what everybody else's career looks like who can look back on 40 years now. But I'm trying to think about breadth versus depth. And so, can I better serve people by focusing on Ojibwa folks in the Leech Lake Reservation, or can I better serve people by focusing on racially and ethnically minoritized communities generally? What advice do you give to a junior researcher thinking about that breadth versus depth question?
Well, I'd like to, well, thank you for that question. And it's very apropos. And it's just not related to junior people either. You know, we senior people ask that question as well. I like to start with, what's your passion? Because I think passion drives people. What's your commitment to what it is that you really want to understand? If we make our science questions always political and what makes us most comfortable, I think that's anti-scientific. We will not get there, most likely. We'll play it safe. Some of the best discoveries in the world, people took a chance. Okay, they stepped outside of the norm. Okay, one of my classic books that I love to read, and I've reread it I don't know how many times, is The Structure of Scientific Revolution by Thomas Kuhn. Okay, it's published in the 70s. You can go on Amazon, you can Google it, and you can get it. But what Thomas Kuhn wrote about is timeless. If we are in the midst of our scientific process and it's not working, we have to shift. So where in that shift is your passion? Or can you create a passion? You know, where is it that you feel you can have the greatest impact? And that requires some self-reflection. Remember, in one of the slides, I said, you know, what's this reflexivity? How much am I wedded to my discipline? We were trained to be wedded to our disciplines, but given certain things, we have to step back from our disciplines and interrogate ourselves about, my discipline didn't expand me enough. And I'm not prepared enough to really understand an inclusive approach to the scientific approach. I never really learned what that inclusion should look like. And what are the processes involved in that? Okay, so it's a trail that leads to other trails. That's a whole career. That's like 25, 30, 40 years around something. And I must say, as a graduate student at Northwestern, having finished in, I think, 1975, Howard Becker, a renowned sociologist, I told him I wanted to study Black older people. And he said, you know, in other words, okay, we're going to learn this together, so to speak. and I predate NIA. NIA didn't even exist when I was in graduate school. I think it started the last year I graduated from Northwestern. But I knew some kind of way, which was my undergrad teaching, that's something I wanted to do, whether anybody else was doing it or not. And that's the one thing Northwestern allowed us to do. Have the imagination, reimagine, continue to imagine. And it's restructuring, reimagining, restructuring. Never lose that. If you get wedded to the safe side, we're not good scientists.
Yeah.
We can't discover that way.
Right. Well, we're at 2:00 when we're going to break into another session. There were still a couple of questions in the chat. I'm wondering if you would mind if maybe I have them copied.
Okay, sure.
If they can send me their that's sorry, it's Lennis and Jasmine. If you send me an email with your email, then I can make the connection with Peggy.
Absolutely, and I will respond to your questions.
Yeah.
This is a very involved discussion, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it requires time, you know, to really get out, you know, rethinking all this stuff. And that's where I think that's where we need to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next session with the scientists is a separate Zoom link. So we'll stop this one. I'll put my